It's hard not to notice how strange this moment feels, because confrontations like this usually happen behind closed doors, filtered through aides and phrased so carefully that nobody quite owns them. Here, though, the tension between Jerome Powell and Merrick Garland has drifted into the open. And once that happens, it stops being a technical dispute and starts feeling like a test of boundaries. Powell isn't just another official complaining about scrutiny. He's the steward of an institution whose power rests almost entirely on trust. Garland isn't just another attorney general defending procedure. He's the embodiment of a justice system that insists process matters more than discomfort. When those two logics collide, the collision doesn't stay small for long. From Powell's perspective, the concern sounds deceptively simple. The Federal Reserve only works if markets believe it is insulated from political pressure, not immune to oversight, but protected from leverage. Once investors suspect that monetary decisions might be nudged, prodded, or chilled by investigative threats, the signal coming from the Fed's actions gets distorted. Powell's warnings haven't been theatrical, but they've been pointed enough to raise eyebrows. He has spoken as someone worried less about himself and more about what happens when the referee is perceived as being shoved by players on the field. Garland's position, on the surface, is just as straightforward. No institution, no matter how revered, gets a free pass from legal scrutiny simply because scrutiny is inconvenient. The Department of Justice exists to follow facts where they lead, not to protect reputations or calm markets. From that vantage point, complaints about independence can sound like attempts to preempt accountability. Garland's language has stayed procedural, but procedure can feel like pressure when it points inward. The friction comes from how those two narratives talk past each other. Powell hears investigation and imagines markets wondering whether interest rate decisions will be second-guessed through subpoenas. Garland hears resistance and imagines a powerful institution arguing for special treatment. Neither is accusing the other outright, yet the implications hang in the air like humidity. Each side insists it's defending something fundamental, and neither is eager to concede the ground that makes its argument coherent. What makes the moment especially charged is how rarely these worlds overlap so directly. The Fed is designed to operate at arm's length from day-to-day politics, shielded precisely to prevent short-term incentives from warping long-term stability. The Justice Department, by contrast, is designed to push into uncomfortable spaces, especially when power is involved. When those missions intersect, the system doesn't have a neat instruction manual. Instead, it relies on restraint, precedent, and a shared sense of where the line ought to be. Powell's public pushback has been interpreted in different ways depending on who's listening. To some, it sounds like a necessary alarm bell, a reminder that independence isn't an abstract ideal, but a fragile equilibrium. To others, it sounds like an overreaction, or worse, an attempt to frame oversight as illegitimate before anyone sees the details. The ambiguity matters, because ambiguity is where political narratives are born. Once people start choosing which interpretation feels right, the argument stops being technical and starts becoming tribal. Garland, for his part, has leaned on the oldest defense in the justice playbook. The law applies evenly, and discomfort is not a disqualifier for inquiry. That position resonates deeply in a culture that has grown suspicious of institutions protecting themselves. At the same time, it raises uneasy questions about timing and perception. Even a perfectly justified investigation can have consequences beyond its legal scope, especially when markets are watching. This is where the debate gets genuinely uncomfortable. Can an investigation be both legitimate and destabilizing at the same time? Is it possible for the Justice Department to act properly while still triggering economic anxiety? And if so, whose responsibility is it to manage that fallout? The system offers no clean answers, only competing risks. Powell seems to be arguing that the risk to credibility outweighs the benefit of public scrutiny in this context. Garland seems to be arguing that credibility built on exemption is credibility built on sand. Both arguments have internal logic, which is precisely why the standoff feels so tense. It's not a clash between right and wrong, but between two definitions of responsibility. And those definitions are colliding in real time. What adds another layer of complexity is the audience. Markets don't read transcripts the way lawyers do. They react to signals, headlines, and perceived shifts in power. A hint that the Fed's independence is under strain can ripple outward faster than any official clarification. Powell understands that instinctively, because managing expectations is half his job. Garland understands, too, but his mandate doesn't include calming traders. That mismatch in incentives fuels suspicion on both sides. Fed defenders worry that legal pressure could become a tool, even unintentionally, to influence policy outcomes. DOJ defenders worry that invoking market stability could become a shield against necessary questions. Neither side has to be acting in bad faith for those worries to feel real. The mere possibility is enough to keep the argument alive. There's also a cultural dimension that shouldn't be ignored. The Fed has long been treated as a kind of secular priesthood, opaque but respected, mysterious but trusted. In recent years, that mystique has eroded as economic pain has made monetary policy feel personal. Interest rates aren't abstractions when mortgages and credit cards are involved. That shift has made the Fed more politically visible, whether it likes it or not. Garland's Justice Department operates in a different cultural moment. Public trust in legal institutions has been strained, but so has tolerance for perceived immunity. Many Americans are tired of hearing that powerful entities are simply too important to question. That mood makes Garland's stance intuitively appealing to a broad audience. It frames oversight as a democratic reflex rather than an act of aggression. The problem is that intuitive appeal doesn't cancel structural risk. You can believe in equal application of the law and still worry about unintended consequences. You can value independence and still accept that independence isn't absolute. The Powell-Garland standoff lives in that gray space, where every move solves one problem and creates another. That's why it refuses to settle into a single storyline. Some observers have tried to reduce the clash to personality, but that feels lazy. Powell isn't known as a bomb thrower, and Garland isn't known as a crusader. Both have reputations for caution, which makes their divergence more striking, not less. When cautious figures start signaling discomfort, it usually means the underlying issue is pressing. At minimum, it means the informal guardrails are being tested. Those guardrails matter more than most people realize. They are the unspoken agreements that keep institutions from grinding against each other. Once those agreements fray, even normal actions can feel provocative. An investigation feels like intimidation, and a warning feels like defiance. The feedback loop tightens, and trust drains out quietly. What's fascinating is how much of this fight is happening through implication rather than accusation. Powell doesn't have to say, "This is political," for the word to hover nearby. Garland doesn't have to say, "No one is untouchable," for the message to land. Both are speaking in a register that allows deniability while signaling resolve. That's a hallmark of conflicts where the stakes are too high for blunt language. The financial world, predictably, has been parsing every syllable. Traders aren't asking who's morally right. They're asking what this means for stability. Even the hint that monetary policy could become entangled with legal drama introduces noise. Noise is poison to markets, which thrive on predictability even when conditions are tough. Powell's warnings can be read as an attempt to dampen that noise before it amplifies. Yet, from a civic standpoint, there's discomfort in the idea that market reaction should constrain legal inquiry. If fear of volatility becomes a veto, accountability narrows quickly. Garland's defenders argue that the justice system can't operate on a volatility index. They worry that privileging calm over scrutiny creates perverse incentives. That worry isn't paranoid. History offers plenty of cautionary examples. So the question becomes less about who is right and more about what balance looks like. How much insulation does independence require? How much scrutiny does accountability demand? And who gets to decide when those principles collide? The Constitution doesn't spell that out in tidy paragraphs. This ambiguity is why the confrontation feels so hot, despite its measured tone. It taps into deeper anxieties about power, trust, and the fragility of systems we rely on. People sense that if this line shifts, others might follow. A precedent here could echo elsewhere, in ways nobody fully predicts. That possibility alone is enough to keep attention locked in. There's also an element of timing that adds pressure. Economic uncertainty amplifies sensitivity to any perceived threat to stability. Legal scrutiny during such moments feels heavier, regardless of its merits. Powell's caution reflects that context, not just institutional self-interest. Garland's insistence reflects a different reading of the same moment. Neither man is likely to back down easily, because backing down would imply conceding principle. Powell can't casually minimize independence without undermining his own warnings. Garland can't casually narrow oversight without undermining the DOJ's posture. So the standoff persists, not as a shouting match, but as a slow burn. That slow burn is often more consequential than overt conflict. What makes this especially compelling as a political moment is that it forces observers to sit with contradiction. You can sympathize with Powell's fear of politicization and still believe Garland is right about legal consistency. You can worry about market confidence and still reject the idea of institutional immunity. The debate doesn't reward easy answers, which is rare in modern discourse. It asks viewers to hold two uncomfortable thoughts at once. That discomfort is likely to define how this episode is remembered. Not as a scandal with a clean resolution, but as a stress test of boundaries. A moment when the lines between independence and oversight were traced more sharply. Whether those lines hold or shift remains an open question. For now, the tension itself is the story. As the tension carries on, what's striking is how little either side seems interested in theatrical escalation. There are no shouted accusations, no personal insults, no dramatic ultimatums. Instead, the conflict advances through tone, timing, and carefully chosen phrases that sound calm while carrying weight. That restraint is part of what makes the situation feel so loaded. When experienced institutional figures start signaling concern without raising their voices, people tend to listen more closely. Powell's comments, when read carefully, don't sound like a man claiming victimhood. They sound like someone worried about second-order effects, the things that don't show up in press releases but show up in bond yields. He speaks as if credibility were a living thing, something that can't be rebuilt overnight once damaged. That worldview comes from years of watching markets react not just to actions, but to perceived intentions. In Powell's universe, perception isn't cosmetic, it's structural. Garland's replies, equally measured, carry a different kind of gravity. They reflect a belief that credibility also erodes when powerful institutions appear insulated. From that angle, trust isn't protected by distance from scrutiny, but by consistency under it. If some entities are spared difficult questions because the consequences might be inconvenient, the system begins to tilt. Garland's calm insistence on process reads as a warning against that tilt. This is why the debate feels almost philosophical beneath the surface. Powell is effectively asking whether legitimacy depends more on insulation or predictability. Garland is asking whether legitimacy can survive exceptions, even well-intentioned ones. Both are arguing for trust, but they're defining it differently. That difference is subtle enough to confuse casual observers and sharp enough to divide experts. The media, predictably, struggles with subtlety. It prefers clean storylines, heroes and antagonists, winners and losers. But this standoff resists that framing, which makes coverage feel fragmented. Some outlets emphasize the danger to markets, others emphasize the danger of unchecked power. Each emphasis says as much about the outlet as it does about the issue. Public reaction mirrors that split, though in less precise language. Some people hear Powell and think, finally, someone defending stability from political meddling. Others hear him and think, here we go again, another institution claiming it's too special to be questioned. Garland elicits the reverse reactions, admired as principled by some, distrusted as overreaching by others. The lines don't fall neatly along party boundaries, which only adds to the confusion. That cross-cutting response is important. It suggests the issue taps into broader anxieties that transcend partisan loyalty. People are wrestling with competing instincts. Protect what works versus challenge what concentrates power. The Fed, after all, affects daily life in ways most agencies don't. That intimacy raises the emotional stakes of any perceived threat to its autonomy. At the same time, the Justice Department represents a different kind of intimacy. It embodies the promise that rules apply evenly, even when enforcement is uncomfortable. When Garland speaks, some hear reassurance that no one is exempt. Others hear a reminder that legal power, too, can unsettle systems when deployed without sensitivity to context. That duality keeps the debate alive rather than resolved. Behind all of this sits a quieter question that few want to articulate openly. What happens if institutions stop trusting each other's restraint? Much of the American system relies not just on written law, but on mutual confidence that powers won't be abused. When that confidence frays, actors start protecting themselves preemptively. Preemption can quickly look like escalation, even when it isn't intended that way. Powell's warnings could be read as preemptive defense of independence. Garland's insistence could be read as preemptive defense of legal authority. Neither wants to be the one who blinked first, because blinking suggests weakness. Yet prolonged staring contests rarely end without someone miscalculating. That risk is what keeps observers uneasy. There's also the matter of precedent, which looms over every institutional dispute. Whatever happens here will be cited later, selectively and strategically. Future officials will point back and say, remember when this line was crossed, even if the memory is simplified. That's how norms shift, not through dramatic rewrites, but through accumulated references. Powell and Garland both know they're not just acting for the present moment. In private conversations, one imagines aides urging caution on both sides. Choose words carefully. Avoid absolutes. Leave room for retreat. Public firmness paired with private flexibility is often how Washington survives tense moments. Whether that balance holds here remains uncertain. The longer the issue stays unresolved, the more symbolic it becomes. Symbolism can be dangerous. Once a dispute becomes a symbol, compromise starts to look like surrender. No one wants to be remembered as the person who weakened independence or diluted accountability. That fear hardens positions even when practical solutions exist. It turns manageable disagreements into identity tests. Still, There are signs that both sides understand the cost of open rupture. Neither has moved toward overt confrontation. There's a careful choreography at work, one that suggests awareness of how fragile confidence really is. That choreography may yet produce an outcome that feels anticlimactic. Ironically, anticlimax might be the healthiest resolution available. If the tension eventually cools without fireworks, critics on all sides will claim victory. Powell's defenders will say independence was preserved. Garland's defenders will say accountability was affirmed. The absence of collapse will be interpreted as proof that restraint prevailed. And yet, the memory of the clash will still linger, because even a restrained confrontation leaves marks. It changes how institutions speak to each other. It makes future warnings sound sharper and future investigations feel heavier. The system doesn't forget moments when its seams were visible. It simply adjusts, quietly, to avoid tearing next time. In that sense, the Powell-Garland standoff may matter less for what it resolves than for what it reveals. It reveals how narrow the space is between independence and oversight, how quickly good faith actions can be interpreted as pressure, how dependent stability is on shared assumptions that can't be legislated, and how fragile trust becomes once those assumptions are questioned. For viewers trying to make sense of it all, the healthiest response may be discomfort rather than certainty. Discomfort forces attention, patience, and skepticism without cynicism. It resists the urge to declare winners before consequences unfold. And it acknowledges that some conflicts don't offer moral clarity, only trade-offs. Those are often the conflicts that shape systems most profoundly. As things stand, Powell and Garland remain locked in a careful dance. Each step measured, each word weighed, each silence noticed. Neither man appears eager to escalate, yet neither appears willing to retreat. That balance can hold for a while, but it's never permanent. Eventually, something will tip, even if it's subtle. When that happens, it likely won't look dramatic in the moment. It will look like a footnote, a clarification, a procedural adjustment. Only later will people point back and say, that was the turn. That's how institutional history usually works. The loud moments get remembered, but the quiet shifts do the real work. What makes this stretch of the conflict so absorbing is that nothing appears to be moving, and yet everything feels unsettled. There is no formal escalation, no leaked memo that blows the doors open, no dramatic press conference that forces an immediate reckoning. Instead, the pressure accumulates slowly, like a fault line absorbing stress that no one can quite measure. Each public statement is parsed not just for what it says, but for what it avoids. Silence becomes as meaningful as speech, sometimes more so. Powell's restraint has taken on a particular tone as the weeks drag on. He hasn't repeated his warnings endlessly, which would risk sounding defensive. Instead, he allows them to linger, trusting that markets and policymakers understand subtext. That approach reflects a lifetime inside institutions where understatement is a form of authority. In that world, saying less is often interpreted as saying something important. Garland's posture follows a parallel logic. He does not chase Powell's remarks, nor does he attempt to publicly rebut every implication. His silence, too, carries meaning, signaling confidence in process rather than anxiety about optics. For seasoned observers, that calm can be reassuring. For critics, it can feel ominous, like a door quietly closing. This mutual restraint creates a strange vacuum. Without overt confrontation, the debate migrates outward, into commentary, speculation, and inference. Pundits fill the space with hypotheticals, some sober, others theatrical. The further the discussion drifts from the principles, the more distorted it becomes. Yet neither Powell nor Garland seems eager to pull it back into a single narrative. That reluctance may be strategic. Once you define the story, you also define the terms of its resolution. Keeping things ambiguous preserves flexibility, even as it fuels tension. It allows each side to claim fidelity to principle without boxing itself in. But ambiguity has a cost, especially when public trust is already brittle. For the broader audience, ambiguity often reads as concealment. People accustomed to constant updates grow suspicious when information trickles instead of floods. They begin to wonder what's being negotiated off stage. In that environment, even benign coordination can look conspiratorial. The absence of clarity invites imagination, and imagination rarely errs on the side of generosity. This is where the Powell-Garland clash intersects with a deeper cultural shift. Americans are less patient with institutional opacity than they once were. They demand explanations not just for outcomes, but for processes. They want to know not only what decisions are made, but why certain questions are even being asked. That appetite for transparency puts pressure on systems built for discretion. The Fed, by design, resists that pressure. Its power depends on deliberation that is partially shielded from immediate political reaction. Too much transparency can undermine its effectiveness by turning every internal debate into a market signal. Powell's concern reflects that paradox. Openness can destabilize the very stability it seeks to promote. Yet the public increasingly struggles to accept that trade-off without visible justification. The Justice Department operates under a different paradox. Its legitimacy rests on the idea that sunlight deters abuse. Closed-door discretion can look like favoritism, even when it's routine. Garland's insistence on even-handedness speaks to that expectation. But even-handedness, when applied to institutions that shape the economy, carries ripple effects beyond the courtroom. The clash, then, is not just between two men or two offices. It's between two philosophies of legitimacy in a skeptical age. One says legitimacy comes from distance and consistency. The other says legitimacy comes from exposure and equal treatment. Both philosophies have worked in the past, but they don't coexist easily. What complicates matters further is the absence of a neutral referee. There is no higher authority positioned to say definitively where the line should be drawn. Congress is polarized, the courts move slowly, and public opinion is fragmented. In that vacuum, perception becomes the arbiter. And perception is notoriously volatile. Markets, for instance, react not to legal nuance, but to perceived risk. A rumor of interference can move billions before it's confirmed or denied. Powell understands this instinctively, which is why his language emphasizes confidence and continuity. He knows that calming markets is as much about tone as policy. Any hint of uncertainty can become self-fulfilling. Legal culture, by contrast, is trained to tolerate uncertainty. Investigations unfold over time. Evidence is weighed. Conclusions are delayed. Garland operates within that tempo, even when the outside world demands immediacy. From that perspective, impatience looks like pressure, and pressure is precisely what the DOJ is supposed to resist. This difference in tempo fuels misunderstanding. Powell speaks in signals designed to stabilize expectations quickly. Garland speaks in processes designed to withstand scrutiny slowly. Each hears the other as slightly out of sync. Neither is wrong, but neither is fully comfortable with the other's rhythm. Observers hoping for a decisive moment may be disappointed. Institutional conflicts of this kind rarely end with dramatic reversals. They fade, mutate, or get absorbed into new norms. What feels like a standoff now may later be remembered as an adjustment period. The significance often becomes clear only in retrospect. Already, subtle changes are detectable. Officials across government have become more cautious about referencing the Fed in legal or political contexts. Language that once felt routine is now double-checked. That caution suggests an awareness of the fragility exposed by the dispute. Even without resolution, behavior has shifted. Similarly, Fed communications have grown more attuned to legal optics. Statements emphasize procedural integrity alongside economic rationale. This isn't a concession so much as an adaptation. Institutions learn from friction, even when they deny being affected by it. Learning, in this sense, is survival. The public, too, is learning, though unevenly. Some viewers have grown more skeptical of both institutions. Others have doubled down on defending one against the other. Few have emerged with greater confidence in the system as a whole. That erosion of confidence is the most concerning byproduct of the standoff. Confidence, once lost, doesn't snap back with a single clarification. It requires repeated demonstrations that principles are more than talking points. Powell and Garland are both acutely aware of this, even if they emphasize different principles. Their challenge is not just to prevail, but to reassure. Reassurance, however, is hard when the audience is primed to doubt. The irony is that both men likely see themselves as guardians against misuse of power. Powell guards against political intrusion into monetary policy. Garland guards against selective immunity from legal scrutiny. Each frames his stance as protective, not aggressive. Yet protection from one angle can look like threat from another. That duality explains why the conflict feels so unresolved. There is no villain to banish, no simple fix to implement, only a delicate recalibration of norms that were once taken for granted. Norms, unlike laws, change quietly and unevenly. They shift through practice, not proclamation. As time passes, the urgency of the moment may recede, but its lessons will persist. Future officials will remember how quickly a technical issue became a symbolic one. They will remember how words intended for one audience were heard by another. They will remember the cost of ambiguity in an age hungry for clarity. Those memories will shape decisions long after headlines move on. It's possible that years from now, analysts will look back and see this as a turning point, not because of any single outcome, but because it marked a new sensitivity, a recognition that institutional independence and accountability are no longer insulated concepts. They interact visibly, sometimes uncomfortably, in public view. Managing that interaction may become one of the defining challenges of modern governance. For now, the Powell-Garland confrontation remains suspended. Neither side has crossed a line that forces an immediate reckoning, yet both have tested boundaries enough to make retreat difficult. The space between them is charged, even if quiet. And quiet tension often lasts longer than loud conflict. In that quiet, the public continues to watch, interpret, and speculate. They project hopes and fears onto two men who may not fully control the narrative surrounding them. That projection is unavoidable in a media environment that thrives on implication. Once a story captures imagination, it takes on a life of its own. The principles can influence it, but they can't own it. Ultimately, this episode underscores a reality many prefer to ignore. Institutions are only as strong as the assumptions that sustain them. When those assumptions are questioned, strength must be demonstrated, not asserted. Powell and Garland are demonstrating strength in different ways. Whether those demonstrations restore confidence or deepen doubt remains to be seen. What is certain is that the clash has exposed the fragility of balance. The balance between independence and oversight, stability and scrutiny, discretion and transparency. Maintaining that balance requires constant negotiation, not just formal rules. It requires trust, restraint, and a shared commitment to limits. When any of those weaken, friction becomes inevitable. As observers, the temptation is to demand clarity, to insist on answers that settle the debate. But some debates can't be settled without losing something important. Forcing resolution too quickly risks damaging the very principles at stake. Patience, though frustrating, may be the least harmful option. Whether patience is politically sustainable is another question entirely. So the story continues, not with a bang, but with a watchful pause. Powell and Garland remain symbols of competing imperatives that define modern governance. Their standoff invites reflection more than allegiance. It asks whether we can tolerate complexity without rushing to judgment, and whether our institutions can adapt to scrutiny without collapsing under it. As this chapter edges toward its own quiet conclusion, what becomes clearer is not who won, but how much the definition of winning has changed. There is no single ruling to point to, no decisive announcement that resolves the tension cleanly. Instead, the outcome reveals itself through absence, through what did not happen as much as what did. Markets did not spiral, institutions did not fracture, and yet something intangible shifted beneath the surface. The system held, but it did not come away untouched. That may be the most honest ending available. In moments like this, stability is not the same thing as comfort. Stability simply means the machinery keeps running, even as its operators glance nervously at one another. Comfort would require clarity, reassurance, and restored trust, and those things take longer. They are built slowly, often after the cameras move on. Powell's caution, viewed over time, begins to look less like resistance and more like boundary setting. He drew attention to a line without dramatizing its defense, which is a subtle but consequential choice. By speaking carefully, he avoided turning the issue into a personal feud, even as he made the institutional stakes visible. That restraint preserved room for recalibration rather than rupture. It also left space for critics to argue without forcing escalation. Garland's steadiness, similarly, can be read as deliberate containment. He did not rush to assert dominance or dismiss concern, which would have hardened opposition. Instead, he let process speak, trusting that consistency would eventually carry its own legitimacy. That approach frustrates those who crave immediate resolution, but it aligns with a philosophy that sees endurance, not spectacle, as the measure of authority. Together, those choices shaped an ending that feels unresolved, yet instructive. They demonstrated how conflict between powerful institutions can be managed without spectacle, even when stakes are high. They also exposed how fragile public confidence has become, how easily uncertainty seeps into interpretation. The absence of collapse does not erase the presence of doubt. It merely postpones its reckoning. For the public, this ending offers no catharsis. There is no villain led away, no hero vindicated in sweeping fashion. Instead, there is a lingering question about how much trust can reasonably be asked of institutions that speak in different languages. Economic stability and legal accountability are both essential, yet they rarely synchronize perfectly. Learning to live with that mismatch may be the real challenge ahead. The episode also leaves behind a cautionary lesson about signaling. Words intended to reassure one audience can unsettle another. Silence, meant to convey confidence, can be read as concealment. In a hyper-connected environment, no message travels alone. It arrives trailing interpretations the speaker never authorized. That reality complicates governance in ways earlier generations did not face. Institutions once relied on shared assumptions that no longer hold uniformly. They assumed patience where there is now impatience, deference where there is now skepticism. Neither Powell nor Garland created that environment. They are operating within it, adapting as best they can. The adaptation is ongoing, and its direction is not predetermined. One possible future leans toward increased caution, where institutions avoid friction by narrowing their public posture. Another leans toward increased exposure, where transparency becomes the default regardless of consequence. Neither extreme is sustainable, which suggests a messy middle ground. That middle ground is where norms evolve. Norms, unlike laws, change without announcement. They are shaped by moments like this one, when assumptions are tested but not shattered. The Powell-Garland tension may someday be cited as a footnote, a reminder of when the balance felt precarious, or it may fade into the background, absorbed into routine adjustments no one explicitly credits. Either way, its influence will persist quietly. For future officials, the takeaway will not be ideological. It will be practical. They will remember how quickly a procedural issue became a symbolic one. They will remember how carefully language had to be chosen to avoid misinterpretation. And they will remember that independence and oversight are no longer abstract concepts, but visible points of friction. That memory will shape behavior in subtle ways. Statements will be drafted with greater sensitivity to cross-institutional impact. Investigations will be weighed not only for legal merit, but for systemic consequence. Policy decisions will account for perception as well as substance. None of this will be written into statute, but all of it will matter. The public, too, will carry something forward from this moment. Perhaps not detailed knowledge of the dispute, but a heightened awareness of institutional tension. People have seen that even the most respected entities can find themselves at odds. They have seen that conflict does not always look dramatic to be significant. And they have learned that stability often masks negotiation. That awareness may foster skepticism, but it can also foster maturity. A public that understands trade-offs is less likely to demand simplistic answers. It may still do so emotionally, but the seed of doubt has been planted. Doubt, when paired with curiosity rather than cynicism, can be constructive. Whether it grows that way depends on what follows. In the quiet aftermath, Powell returns to rate decisions, press conferences, and carefully worded guidance. Garland returns to cases, procedures, and the slow grind of legal work. On the surface, everything looks the same. Beneath it, the experience lingers, informing judgments and shaping instincts. That is how institutions learn, through friction rather than instruction. This ending, then, is not about closure, but about continuity. The system absorbs stress, adjusts slightly, and moves forward. It does not resolve every contradiction, nor does it pretend to. It survives by negotiating them again and again. That survival is not glamorous, but it is functional. There is a temptation to frame this moment as a warning sign of institutional decay. There is an equal temptation to frame it as proof of institutional resilience. Both interpretations capture part of the truth and miss another part. Resilience and fragility often coexist. Strength is revealed not by the absence of strain, but by how strain is handled. Powell and Garland handled it without theatrics, which may be the most responsible choice available. They allowed disagreement to surface without letting it metastasize. They signaled concern without declaring crisis. They preserved space for future adjustment rather than forcing premature resolution. In a polarized era, that restraint is notable. Whether restraint will be enough in future clashes is an open question. The forces that produce this tension are not going away. Economic volatility, political pressure, and public skepticism will continue to test boundaries. Each test will leave its own residue. The challenge will be managing accumulation. Accumulated tension can either strengthen norms through adaptation or weaken them through fatigue. The direction depends on leadership, context, and public response. Moments like this one serve as checkpoints rather than endpoints. They ask whether the system is learning or merely enduring. The answer is never immediate. In that sense, the true ending of this story hasn't arrived yet. It will unfold gradually, through choices made long after attention fades, through how confidently the Fed acts under scrutiny, through how judiciously the Justice Department balances rigor and restraint, through how the public responds to complexity without demanding spectacle. For now, the appropriate response may be neither applause nor condemnation. It may be attention. Attention to how language is used, how power is exercised, and how limits are respected. Attention to the spaces where principles overlap and collide. That attention is the quiet work of democratic maintenance. So the final note of this episode is not triumph or defeat. It is awareness. Awareness that independence is fragile, accountability is necessary, and trust is negotiated rather than assumed. Awareness that institutions do not exist in isolation, even when designed to. And awareness that balance, once exposed, must be actively preserved. That preservation will not come from grand gestures. It will come from discipline, humility, and an acceptance of discomfort. It will come from recognizing that tension is not failure, but a signal. A signal that boundaries matter precisely because they are contested, and a signal that the work of governing is never finished.